Welcome to a virtual lecture brought to you by the Nanovic Institute for European Studies from the University of Notre Dame. This is our first spring lecture, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this event. My name is Clemens Sedmak, and I'm the interim director of the Nanovic Institute. The Nanovic Institute's mission is quite simple: to bring Europe to Notre Dame and to bring Notre Dame to Europe. Today, we bring Europe to you in two ways. We bring a European scholar to you, who is at the same time a citizen of the world, both a citizen of the planet and a citizen of the world of ideas. And we bring to you a topic that is of utmost relevance in Europe and beyond. I have the honor of introducing Professor Vittorio Hösle, who will speak to us on the topic, what are the deeper causes of the worldwide rise of populists? The Nanovic Institute's intellectual life largely depends on its faculty fellows. With their research and their brilliance, they make European studies alive here on campus. Today, we have the distinct pleasure of welcoming Vittorio Hösle. Vittorio was born in Italy and completed his PhD in philosophy at the University of Tübingen at the age of 21. He has been called, for good reasons, the Boris Becker of philosophy. Since 1999, Professor Hösle holds the Paul G. Kimball Chair of Arts and Letters at the University of Notre Dame and serves as Professor of German, concurrent Professor of Philosophy, and concurrent Professor of Political Science. He has also served as the founding director of Notre Dame's Institute for Advanced Study. He is a polyglot and at home in many different discourses in every field of philosophy, in history, political analysis, and the humanities at large. If you know the German word Wunderkind, you will understand why Professor Hösle was given this title. If you do not know it, please look at Professor Hösle's CV. Vittorio Hösle has authored more than 50 academic books in many different languages, close to 170 articles, and a number of popular books making philosophical questions accessible to a broader audience. Vittorio is deeply concerned with political developments and an astute observer of developments in the realm of politics. The rise of populism is a major concern of all who follow political dynamics and transformations. Using his vast repertoire of analytical tools, Professor Hösle will shed some light on this phenomenon. He will dig deep and ask profound questions. After the lecture, which will be about 30-35 minutes, there will be the opportunity to ask questions and to engage with our speaker. Please make use of the Q&A button to ask your questions and make your comments. So, what are the deeper causes of the worldwide rise of populists? We are excited to listen to this analysis. Dear Vittorio, welcome so much. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Clemens, for this very kind and generous introduction. It's my honor to speak at the Nanovic Institute that does so much to connect Europe and Notre Dame. I want to speak about an issue which I think is of concern to many of us, the deeper causes of the rise of populism. I will proceed in 3 steps. I will first give you a short approach to the nature of the concept of populism. Then I want to give you some evidence that it is in the rise. And third, I want to try to hazard some reflections on its causes. It's not easy to define populism. In fact, it's interesting that in America, the term does not have the same negative flavor that it has in Europe, certainly due to the fact that an important progressive party in the history of the United States was the People's Party at the end of the 19th century, which was soon called the Populist Party by journalists. And therefore, Americans do not have the same attitude to the term. But what we usually regard as features of the concept is that it is based on an idealization of the people, therefore the name, against presumed corrupt elites. It is often connected with an a proceduralist attitude. We should follow what the people feel based on their common sense, on their affects, not on reason. And certainly we should not continue to spend much time with the cumbersome procedures that characterize the normal parliamentary democracy with separation of powers. And the interests of the people are, of course, the people of the nation at stake. Therefore, it is often connected with an anti-multilateralism, anti-globalization stance. And the perception is that the ruling elites have betrayed the people by colluding with international interests or by developing conspiracies to harm the normal people. Of course, this vague ideology of the populists is often connected to a strategy to get power for the persons who are the leaders of the populist movement. And usually, in fact, the attack against the global elites, even if it pretends to help the interests of the people, is at the same time an attempt to strengthen the power of the leaders, often of one leader, at the expense of the traditional mechanisms of separation of power. And finally, there is an important style connected to populist policies. They are folksy and therefore usually anti-intellectually, unabashedly. They appeal to emotions, even emotions that civilized people regard with suspicion, like anger, even hatred. What is the evidence for this for the rise of populism? I have discussed the issue in my book Globale Fliehkräfte, which came out in the summer of 2019. The third edition will come out in a few weeks, which is strongly enlarged due to the events that we observed in the United States in the last month. So it goes till the inauguration of Joe Biden. And one of the central theses of the book is that we had in a golden quarter of century from 1989 or 91 till 2014 or 16, in which it seemed that the world was on an automatical way toward a general rule of democracies that are peaceful because they're united by free trade. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was the thesis of the end of history, and that this was what would happen. And in fact, the progress that was achieved in these golden quarter of century is remarkable. Since the beginning of the 21st century, we have for the first time a decrease of the global Gini coefficient, which had increased from around 1820 on. Industrialization had, of course, increased inequality in the world because only a few countries industrialized at the beginning. And with the spread of globalization, for the first time again around 2000, we see a decrease of global inequality. But we will see partly paid for by an increase in the national Gini coefficient of almost all OECD countries. The events in 2014 that shocked many people were the Russian invasion of the Crimea and the occupation of Eastern Ukraine, and of course the rise of the Islamic State. But these were phenomena external to the so-called civilized Western world, while in 2016 certain things happened within the Western world that were not easily connectable with the optimistic outlook that we had cherished before. At the outskirts of the Western world, at least an ally of the Western world, the Philippines elected a man, Duterte, who was someone who bragged before he was elected, that he would use the presidency to pardon every day thousands of soldiers and policemen who would kill people without trial, and that he himself announced that he would kill with his own hands a lot of people and then pardon himself, because his understanding of the Philippine constitution entailed that he had the right to pardon his own crimes. In the summer of 2016, we had this failed coup d'etat in Turkey, and certainly this it was good that the coup could be defeated, but it led to a strong movement of Turkey toward an autocracy. This, again, is a NATO country, but not yet a member of the classical Western community. But we saw that in Hungary and Poland, in these years, Poland, the election was in the fall of 2015, but the real changes occurred then in the beginning of 2016. In Hungary, they occurred earlier. We had a strong diminution of the freedom of the mass media and also of the freedom and independence of the courts. For example, in Hungary, the retirement age was suddenly decreased from 70 to 62, which meant that 10% of the judiciary had to retire, and this allowed, of course, the government to fill the places with their own followers. In fact, Orban defended in several speeches the concept of an illiberal democracy. In Poland, in December 2015, a law was passed that allowed the Constitutional Court to declare a law anti-constitutional, not with a normal simple majority, but with a two-thirds majority, which of course rendered it much more difficult to condemn things. Several appointments done by the earlier Saints were rejected. The decision of the Constitutional Court on the constitutionality of the corresponding law was simply bypassed. They refused to publish the court decision. And the European Union, that started procedures according to paragraph 2 of Article 7 of the Treaty on the European Union against Poland because of violation of the rule of law, was shown that it was handling a blunt sword because the procedure can only start if you do not have another country protesting against it. And of course, Hungary hurried to help Poland. Only at the end of the last year, some progress has been made on this issue, but it's clearly convinced those countries that within the European Union wanted to abolish classical structures of the separation of powers, that they had not to fear much. Then we had, of course, a Brexit vote. It was the third referendum in British history on a national level that led to the decision to leave the European Union. And then, of course, we had the election of Trump. The election of Trump led to a rejection of multilateralism. From the beginning, America First had been the slogan of the new political program. Traditional free trade agreements were either rejected or reshaped, and by the way, not all arguments against the free trade agreements were bad, and the replacement of NAFTA by the US, Canada-Mexico agreement was not necessarily bad, but also the cooperation in international climate diplomacy was ended by leaving the Paris Agreement. The security of NATO was openly questioned, and not only did Trump show an isolationist, anti-multilateralist policy of the United States, but he tried to intervene into the European Union by first of all supporting Boris Johnson, even during a state visit in England. While May was still a prime minister, he made clear that he would favor Johnson. He also tried to lure Macron by a special trade agreement to leave the European Union. So there is an explicit intervention into other international organizations. Clearly, another point of his policy was the desire to limit both legal and illegal migration. Connected, this was all, it became clearer and clearer the more the presidency proceeded, with an internal desire to limit, if not to destroy, the horizontal and the vertical separation of powers. The horizontal separation of powers was most dramatically questioned when Trump in 2020 was considering of adjourning Congress, something that has never been done in American history, not even during the Civil War. Fortunately, he could only do it if the two chambers did not agree on a recess, and they were smart enough to avoid a disagreement on this issue, and he threatened to use the military based on the Insurrection Act, even against the will of the member states. As you all know, he lost the elections, but we saw that he tried to put pressure on the member states to refuse the certification of their members of electoral college, and then January 6th, we saw the storm on the Capitol, which was the greatest attack against the legislative in American history, and was, by the way, also an outrage against the judiciary, because all the courts had confirmed the legitimacy of the elections. Regarding the style of Trump, we saw an unhinged personality that tried to continue the reality TV performance that he had as responsible for The Apprentice in real life, and an aggressive anti-universalism. It was clear that by doing so, he was putting particularly the international arena at a high risk, which obviously the international system presupposes reliability and predictability of the various actors. He showed his admiration for dictators like Kim Jong-un without any capacity of solving the diplomatic problems that were existing. I don't want to enter into details because I want to focus on the causes now. Well, what are the causes of what we have seen, and which, by the way, led to an incredibly quick decrease of legitimacy of democracy worldwide? I have a lot of friends in China, and they are often usually committed to the desire to see more of liberalism in China, but many of them told me, if democracy means that you will end up with a type of government like that of Trump, we do not want to go into that direction. Last point that I want to mention, because it shows another feature of the changes that have occurred in the last 5 years. We had a strong counterforce to the elections of 2016 and the election of Macron in 2017, insofar as Macron represented the traditional form of globalized elites. But it is quite interesting to see that Macron formally had something in common with Trump. He had been only 2 years in politics. At least he had had public office, unlike Trump, before he became president. And at the beginning of the year, in 2017, in January, his chances were minimal. While the candidate of the ruling Socialist Party, that in January was maintaining both the president and the prime minister, Hamon got only 8% in the elections in May. All this showed, even if the elections were in the whole positive in the outcome, an extreme volatility of even the French system. In fact, the Front National to the Rassemblement National got 33% in the presidential elections. What are the causes of these changes that we can observe worldwide? And I think the causes are relatively manifold. An important phenomenon that had occurred in many Western democracies in the last 2 decades was the decrease of the legitimacy of Congress. People have lost the trust in their parliaments. In America, in 2004, 30% of the population declared that they had trust in Congress. In 2014, we had arrived at 7%. 7% of the population declare that they have confidence in Congress. It had increased, by the way, in 2018 to 11%, but it's still not a very high number, particularly if you compare how other public institutions fared in the 2018 polls, the military received 74% of people declaring trust in it. And this shows that paradoxically, the institution in whose formation the people has most say, namely parliament, compared with other institutions like the military, the police, the judiciary, even the president, who is elected indirectly in the United States. The institution in whose election the populace has most say enjoyed least confidence, which is not easy to explain because it's fundamentally a vote of no confidence against oneself. I think the reasons are connected to a general decline in the feeling that the population is taken seriously by the political elites. Many people have the feeling they are forgotten by the elites, and it's not even relevant now to determine whether people really are forgotten by the elites or not. The social fact that they believe so is politically relevant. And in fact, we have witnessed an increasing inequality since 1985 in almost all OECD countries. In the USA, in 1980, to 2013, the richest 1% increased their income by 142%, while the median household increased only by 9%. And this 9% were almost all in the time from 1980 to 1989, because from 1989 to 2013, the median household income diminished, in fact, by 0.9%, of course, to a large amount due to the financial crisis of 2008. Now, this is a phenomenon that has a lot of political causes, for example, the refusal to change the tax system, the allowance of monopolies, and the socialization of the costs, for example, of the financial crisis by allowing the gains and profits to be privatized. But it clearly is connected to the globalization. Globalization, as I said at the beginning, decreased global inequality. But since now workers whose wages are much, much lower than in the OECD countries entered into the global market, their competition put down the value of the wages of the workers in the poorer countries. On the other hand, the factor that most experts in economy, and I'm not one obviously, assume played a greater role is automatization. Why? Well, globalization, of course, decreased the value of the labor force in the OECD countries, but it created also a lot of jobs because globalization goes into both directions, while automatization eliminated a lot of the traditional jobs in the secondary sector. And in fact, Charles Fry and Michael Osborne from Oxford think that what we're witnessing now, Industry 4.0, is endangering in the United States up to 47% of the traditional jobs. And of course, we can hope that if certain jobs disappear, new jobs will be created. This has almost always been the case due to, according to the model of a creative destruction of the Schumpeterian model. And clearly, new jobs will be created by the process. But if Fry and Osborne are right, this will be now to a much lesser degree. Interesting is also in which fields new jobs will be created. And the fields in which new jobs will be created are those in which social skills are required, while jobs in which physical strength is necessary can be more or less all be replaced by machines. And this leads not only to the fact that workers whose main abilities are physical are losing the possibility of making a living. What we're witnessing is ultimately no less than the disappearance of the workers' class. And this is quite interesting if you remember the history of economics and political sociology. One of the central theories of Marx was that he witnessed the transition from agricultural societies to industrial societies in the 19th century, that the class of the workers is the class of the future. And you're certainly right. For the second half of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, the primary sector, agriculture, lost more and more in importance and the number of people who got their living from it. But agriculture has been with us since the Neolithic Revolution, and it will stay with us even if in a reduced form, because people have to be fed. And there is no way how you can deal, for example, with animals only by machines. You need special, typically human skills. While it is possible that the rise of the workers' class will be accompanied by an almost complete disappearance of it. And the disappearance of a class is a politically troublesome event, because people belonging to a class don't like that. And the fact that the skills that are now demanded for are to a large amount social skills is connected to another important change that we are witnessing. And that is, to quote the book by Hannah Rosin, The End of Man and the Rise of Woman. In this essay by Fry and Osborne, they look at the jobs of the future. And of the list of jobs they mention, only 2 men have predominance with regard to women. In all the other, like educator, nurse, etc., women have a lead. And this means that the decline of the working class is also accompanied by a decline of traditional gender roles. And this creates, of course, a lot of anger among the people who then vote for populists. These are often, not always, men, because, of course, there are also women who are not happy with the change in the social classes and also in the gender balance. But the classical voter for the populist is a not well-educated man who sees himself threatened. The neo-Nazis were shouting in Charlottesville, "Jews will not replace us." Of course, behind this awful form of anti-Semitism is the fear the way of life for which we are standing is being replaced. And the populist is the one who has a nose for the wrath, the anger, the fears that's outside in the country. And one has certainly to recognize that the traditional democratic elites often ignored the frustration and the despair that was going on in the people. Now, the other important factor is that the traditional political system that we have is a complex balance between 2 principles that are not incompatible with each other, but are still logically independent of each other. And these are the principle of liberalism on the one hand, and the principle of democracy on the other hand. As Orban, in his defense of an illiberal democracy, rightly stated, you can have an illiberal democracy, it's not logically impossible, as you can have also a liberal but not democratic system. The constitutional monarchies of the 19th century were clearly not democratical, but they were, as constitutional systems based on elites working in the parliaments and in the judiciary, liberal. The illiberal democracy is a form in which the people have a say in the elections, but the amount of separation of powers is strongly reduced. Since it is extraordinarily important in such a system to be the power holder and not those who are subject to the power holder who has very far-reaching powers, it is clear that in an illiberal democracy, the power holders will do everything to keep the power, and therefore will almost with necessity try to manipulate the masses. But they can explain to the masses, often successfully, that their attacks against the separation of powers ultimately wants to give the people back the power. One complaint of the illiberal Democrats is, of course, that the traditional system of separation of powers is far too slow in its decision-making because there are a lot of procedural constraints, and that if you vote the populists, every problem will be solved quite quickly. But, of course, the result of this is that by abolishing the restraints due to the separation of powers, the populist leader then has much more power than traditional executives in a liberal system, and that therefore he can violate the will of the people even more quickly. But of course, he is then under the obligation of maintaining popular support through a relentless propaganda. Propaganda became a science in the 1920s. It was Bernays, the nephew of Freud, who had emigrated as a child to the United States, who wrote the first book on propaganda, which becomes a discipline. How can you try to manipulate people to either buy the product that you want to sell them, or to vote for the political program that endorses your own power position? And clearly, manipulation is facilitated if we give up the idea that there is something which is objectively good. If we don't believe that there's an objective truth, and that there are objective values, that there is such a thing as a common good, then the question is not to try to find out what that is, but the task is to try to organize voters in such a way that they maintain the power holder in his or her position. And that is, to a large amount, what we have witnessed in the last decades, and which in my eyes is one of the most dangerous aspects for the future of democracy, because democracy presupposes in its idea, the liberal democracy, that there are facts that we can try in a common discourse to find out what is the case and what ought to be the case if we are committed to a certain value order and an idea of the common good. And all this has been endangered, and this is what makes the situation so difficult, to a large amount by the left. It was the left that, after the collapse of Marxism in the 1980s, embraced to a large amount social constructivist doctrines and taught us that science is nothing else than the power game of traditional elites, often white men, that there is no objective truth, etc. And one shouldn't be too surprised that then we find Mrs. Conway speaking about alternative facts, or Rudy Giuliani telling us that truth isn't truth. After all, we have heard it since the Nietzscheanization of the left occurred in the late 20th century. In this situation, it is also, of course, extremely important to understand what people believe in order to know how you can manipulate them efficiently to get them where you want to have them. And a very important factor in order to understand what has occurred is clearly the development of the new mass media, the new social media. McLuhan published in the 1960s his famous book, Understanding Media, whose central thesis is, of course, an exaggeration, is the medium is a message. In this form, obviously, the thesis is absurd, because if it were true, there could not be several media in the same message if there were an identity. But what McLuhan meant, and he put his innovative discovery in a simplified way, but this should not deter us from trying to understand the value of his insight, is that media influence the message. They do not determine the message completely. But for example, they eliminate certain types of messages, and they even oblige messages that are compatible with the medium to appear in a garb that takes away important aspects of a message. And that is, for example, what we have witnessed with a new medium of Twitter. If fundamentally your formation of political judgment is no longer based on the reading of difficult books on constitutional law, on the Federalist Papers, on works of social sciences and economics, but it's based on the tweets of a tweeter-in-chief with whom you are linked, it is impossible that you can understand problems of greater complexity. And it is also impossible that you can be able to engage in a fruitful conversation with people who are on the other end of a political spectrum, but are also fundamentally fed by the same type of medium. And this is one of the most dangerous factors that we have witnessed in the last years, that the various political ends form echo chambers in which you hear only voices of people that think ultimately the same like you, and are no longer able to engage in a conversation with people on the other side. And this is, of course, strengthened by the fact that you perceive the people on the other side of the political spectrum as being ultimately of another kind. In America, the political conflicts are unfortunately superimposed on the so-called cultural wars, which started in the 1960s, and that had to do with the fact that the traditional form of American religiosity, mostly a Protestant and deeply rooted in many ideas of the 17th and 18th century, was challenged by the left. And the United States did not succeed in forming a worldview that could be accepted by people on both sides. Germany succeeded in doing so in the 19th century when the Enlightenment changes were brought to the country, also because religion was in the hand of a very educated elite, and therefore the elite was able to use religion in a relatively rational way. In America, the right perceives the left as atheist, and the left, the right, as bigoted. And if this is the case, it's very difficult to agree on questions like the budget, because you do not think that the other person are agreeing with you on certain basic aspects. And all this are factors that, in my eyes, will remain with us. We all, at least I am very happy that Trump is no longer in the White House, but I think it is extremely naive to say, now we are over it. Let's look at the poll in February after the events of January 6th, which was a coup d'etat attempt, which fortunately failed due to the lack of discipline and white side and organization of President Trump, that 70% of Republican voters still strongly support Trump. I also think that in Europe, the right-wing parties have a remarkable future. Think of the fact that in the 2019 European Parliament elections, the French party that got most votes was the Rassemblement National. Of course, you can say that this is due to the fact that in elections for European Parliament, European citizens often unleash the worst instincts because they think it's not that important, and partly this is certainly true. But I think it would be naive to assume, after you have seen, for example, what happened with the Gilets jaunes, that the extreme right in France is over. We'll hear more of them. And therefore, I think history promises to be suspenseful also after the return to some form of political rationality, thanks to the inauguration of President Biden. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Vittorio. I tried to start my video. Here I can start my video. Thank you so much, Vittorio, for a brilliant and thought-provoking lecture. We have about 15 minutes, maximum of 20 minutes for Q&A. If you are willing and ready, Vittorio, we have one question by Felipe Fernandez Armesto, who also gave us a great lecture in the fall. And his question is, I'm getting the impression that Vittorio draws our attention to a sense of cultural threat, especially among male workers. He also cites a diminution of democracy as a result of voters' mistrust in political elites. If I understand it right, elites like intellectuals, plutocrats, technocrats, bureaucrats, judges, representative institutions, and a globalized elite. And then the question, how can voters' dethronement of such elites be a diminution of democracy?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, Felipe. Thank you so much. I regret that I cannot see anybody. I can only read the questions. Well, the answer is, of course, that the word democracy has two different meanings. The one meaning of democracy is simply the rule of the people. The other is what we normally understand by democracy, even if we don't say it, the liberal democracy based on separation of powers. In my book, Morals and Politics, I argue that from a moral point of view, a political system has to satisfy three criteria. First of all, there must be a saying of the people. People must have a possibility to vote out, to get rid of a government by elections. They must be able to be heard in the political process. But secondly, I argue, since it's extremely important that individual rights are not violated, we need checks on the principle of majority. And therefore, I strongly argue for a liberal democracy with an independence of the judiciary. It's, in my eyes, even problematic that in a country like the United States, judges are elected, sometimes even re-elected. This is contrary to the classical understanding of liberal democracy, and I prefer the traditional understanding of liberal democracy. And then I also do think that there is an aristocratic moment in the traditional legitimacy of democracy. The true democracy should be an aristocracy, and aristocracy not in the sense that people come to the place because they're based on birth. This is not a criterion for qualification. We want to have the best qualified people in the responsible jobs. And this is, for me, the ideal political system in which we have a balance between universal suffrage, a system of separation of powers, and an intelligent way of forming elites. And when I say that there's a diminution of democracy in the attack against this type of system, I indeed mean liberal democracy with a competently chosen elites. And I am convinced that it is, in the long term, in the best interest of the people to have such a system. I mean, let me give you an example. A few weeks ago, I had an internet discussion with a very respected colleague from Italy, who was very angry that Mattarella, the Italian president, had appointed this technocratic government under Draghi. Saying, yeah, this is a government of bankers and experts. It's a non-democratic government. Well, first of all, Mattarella has been elected in the constitutional way by the responsible organ. So he has the democratic authority to appoint the prime minister. Second, Draghi had to get a vote of non-confidence in both chambers. And the fact that Draghi is an excellent financial expert, in my eyes, is good. I prefer him to someone like the leader of the Cinque Stelle, Beppe Grillo, who, as not everyone knows in the United States, does not sit in parliament because he is beyond that, but he cannot sit in parliament because he killed, through reckless driving, 2 people. So he's a person who has been sentenced several times by criminal courts, not only because of this fact, but because of his slandering other people in his demagogical speeches. I prefer Maurizio Draghi to Beppe Grillo, even if probably Beppe Grillo would get more popular support than Maurizio Draghi, but I don't think this would lead to a better government. So again, the word democracy has an ambivalent meaning. Do we mean by that only the principle of majority, or the liberal democracy with aristocratic election? And let me end with a remark that I find found always very interesting. Carl Schmitt, who was a great jurist, but as we all know, became then a Nazi, in 1933, after the appointment of Hitler as Chancellor, said, what we're now having, and now he had become a Nazi, he was in favor of that, is the triumph of democracy over liberalism. Principle of majority will rule at the expense of individual rights. And if we see that, then we become a little bit more hesitant with our enthusiasm for democracy without qualification.
Thank you so much, Vittorio. We have another high-level question from Mark Roach. Vittorio, what are 2 or 3 suggestions would you make on how faculty and students can work to address this horrific problem? 3 suggestions?
Mark, this is a great question. And I mean, I would say certainly an extremely important thing is political education. And political education means that you understand, for example, how this great constitution works. I mean, in my book of 19, I already said that the reason why I'm not too pessimistic with regard to the future of the United States, even if we narrowly escaped the transition to a democracy, we really narrowly escaped that, is the fact that we have such an excellent constitution. And the more you study the American Constitution, the more you must admire it. Coming from Germany, where we have, of course, a Bundeswahlleiter, someone who on the federal level is responsible for federal elections, I found it always peculiar that the United States, the election of the president in the hands of the states, and that there is no federal structure really responsible for them. But after the attempts of Trump to put pressure, for example, on Raffensperger, the Secretary of State in Georgia, we have seen that it is beneficial that the Electoral College constitution is in the hand of the states. It would have been much easier for Trump to put pressure on an equivalent of a Bundeswahlleiter to move towards a forgery of the elections. So let's explain to our students why this constitution is as it is. And I really think that this has to be done on a general level. And secondly, let us try to explain to students why the vague philosophical ideas that are linked to postmodernism, destruction of a belief in objective truth, are first logically inconsistent and therefore false, and secondly deleterious in their applications to the world. This seem to me the basic aspects. And as a Catholic institution, we can certainly built on a rich tradition of the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church is not a democratic institution, and frankly, I don't want it to become a democratic institution. I don't want that, for example, the Pope is determined by an election on Twitter. I think it is very good that it is a very, very complex process how you get to high ecclesiastic offices. And the Catholic Church made its peace with democracy in the course of the 20th century, in America earlier. As Tocqueville remarked to his great surprise when he came to the United States, he saw that American Catholics were committed to democracy, but the church as a whole only in the 20th century. But they did it because they were always, not always, but they were committed to basic idea of natural law. We should make clear that democracy has to be integrated into a strong concept of natural law, and not the other way around, that democracy is the way how we determine what natural law is.
Thank you, Vittorio. We have a question from an anonymous attendee, maybe a student. Do you foresee, Professor, a change in the two-party system in the United States? It seems that tensions between right and left have grown exaggerately and exponentially. A figure like Bernie Sanders, who remains popular, suggests to me that Republican versus Democrat may not be the only feature of future US elections.
Yeah, that is an interesting question. As you know, the fact that America has a bipartisan system is a consequence of the fact that we have plurality system, you say in English, in our elections. This means that the one who gets more votes than the others gets elected. it's quite interesting that political science relatively late understood the connection. People speak of one of the few laws of political science that are more or less undisputed about Duverger's law. Duverger was a French political scientist who died, I think, only 10 or 20 years ago, who discovered this law in the 1950s. And the argument is quite interesting. It shows you, by the way, that political laws are not simply empirical facts, but are based on the analysis of rational intentions of people. If you are in a system in which you do not have a proportional distribution of votes, like, for example, in a proportional election system, giving your vote to a third party usually risks that you squander your vote, and that in fact you help the other party who is far away from you. That is, in fact, what happened to a large amount in American history. The fact that George W. Bush was elected in 2000, not with a popular but with electoral college vote, had to do with the fact that Ralph Nader from the Green Party took away quite a lot of votes. If he had not run, Gore would have become president, which would have been certainly better for environmental policies. So as a person, as I am, very much dedicated to the environmental policy, I would have voted in 2000, if I had already been an American citizen by then, for Gore and not for Nader, even if I might have agreed with Nader more on several issues. And this is the fundamental problem. Now, there are, in America, there has been no successful third party. We have had the Progressive Party at the beginning of the 20th century that had some impact, but it then disappeared. There has been some change in a system analogous, electoral system analogous to the United States in the United Kingdom. Insofar as in the 19th century, we had the opposition between the conservatives and the liberals, and the liberals were then more or less replaced by the Labour Party. And this has, of course, to do with changes in the suffrage system. Workers could vote, and such radical changes may then lead to a shift. It's also true that if the popular unsatisfaction with the two parties is such that people are willing to take the risk, some changes may occur in the United Kingdom. We had in 2019 a so-called hung parliament, but it's very, very rare, and so I don't think it will happen in the United States. In fact, Trump, in his recent speech, said explicitly that he does not want to split the Republican Party because he knows that this would lead to the perpetuation of the Democrats being in power. And it's interesting that he clearly says he doesn't want to do it. At the same time, I think the other Republicans know that he would be willing to do that. If you analyze it from a game theoretical point of view, it's a chicken situation. Even if it would destroy the Republican Party, he is the person whom you believe if he makes this threat. The threat is credible given the personality of Trump. And this explains why the majority of the Republicans are accepting his leadership. It will be very difficult to replace him because there is no one else with such an appeal. And if now the Democrats, to go back to your question, would split the party, then of course they would lose. So unfortunately, I don't see that we can overcome the bipartisan nature of the American political system as long as we have the electoral, the voting system that we have. We would have to shift to a proportional voting system, which, by the way, is compatible with the American Constitution, but it does not correspond to the political traditions of this country.
Thank you so much, Vittorio. We have another question, and this time it's not in the Q&A, it's in the chat. How optimistic are you that the European Union will be able to hold far-right rulers such as Hungary's Viktor Orban and his brand of dictatorial democracy, or to a lesser extent Poland, to account for breaching fundamental rights?
Yes, it's a very complex issue because on the one hand, as I said at the beginning, the constitutional possibilities, if you want to use the term constitution when you speak about the European Union, are limited by the fact that one single veto by one of the now 27 European countries except, of course, the country that is proceeded against, is sufficient to block the condemnation of a country. However, at the end of the last year, in connection with passing the new budget, the European Union was able to start certain procedures by saying the budget will not start if you don't agree on that. Still, they had to make a compromise because for some time it was unclear whether the budget would be passed, which has been an absolutely deleterious situation for the European Union, also because many countries needed the help which the European Union generously had agreed to because of the coronavirus crisis. And they had to make a compromise that, for example, for the next 2 years, Orban can do more or less what he wants, so he will certainly win the next elections. The agreement was, I think, that they have the possibility to go to the European Court, and that usually takes 2 years, and therefore the next election is already guaranteed for Orban. But it might be that the sword will become less blunt than it has been to the present. But the situation would certainly change dramatically if, for example, France gets a government based on the Rassemblement National, or if Italy, if the government falls apart, formed with great difficulties recently. You have probably heard that the leader of the Partito Democratico, Zingaretti, had to resign last week. And many people are worried about the stability of the Italian government. If we have elections in Italy, it's not unlikely at all that Salvini from the Lega and Giorgia Meloni from the Fratelli d'Italia were open fascists. I mean, they continue the program of the Italian fascists, will win the elections. And if one of the major states of Europe, Italy or France, has a right-wing government in place, then the possibilities of the European Union to act, which are already now very limited, will fundamentally vanish. And so I would lie if I say I'm optimistic that the European Union will be a bulwark of a constitutional democracy in the world. Fortunately, now people can look up again at the United States, and we hope that this will stay. But it is well possible that in 2 years, also because Republicans are very active in trying to change electoral votes, we will have a same paralyzed situation in the three branches of government as we had in the last 6 years of the Obama presidency. And that the country will return to a state where very few things can be done, but the political acrimony will achieve a pitch, if not increase in pitch, compared to what we have had in the last years. So it is not so that the triumph of liberal democracy is guaranteed. We have to fight for it. There is no alternative to that from a moral point of view. But my book was criticized as being relatively pessimistic. And I don't think that was the intent of the book. It may be that it came over like that. But my opinion is we have only a right to be optimistic if we look at the dangers that exist honestly and frankly. And many people simply think that, perhaps inspired by Fukuyama, the victory of the liberal democracy and free trade in the world is guaranteed. No, it's not guaranteed. And we have seen in the last years that there are many, many dangers. And one point which I could not mention today, but which plays an important role in my book, is, of course, the international arena. The international arena is dangerous because Russia is clearly determined to try to get back superpower status, and they have been quite successful. I greatly admire Obama, but one of his most irresponsible remarks was when he called Russia a regional power. Well, they took their revenge. Fundamentally, being able to put in a person without any qualification into the White House, which was due not only, but also to the Russian intervention, is not bad for a regional power. They were quite successful in that, and they tried again in 2020. And at the same time, we witness that Russia and China are working more and more closely together. That is a dangerous situation. So we have to obviously strengthen the transatlantic alliance. The United States and, despite all its weaknesses, the European Union are the pillars of illiberal democracy in the world. And therefore, I am honored and glad to be both an American and a German, and very glad to have as director of the Nanovic Institute an Austrian who is also a citizen of the world, like my respected colleague and friend Clemens Sedlak.
Thank you so much, Vittorio. I'm afraid that we are at time, so we have to apologize to Warren von Eschenbach, who provided another question. Maybe we can sort it out behind the scenes. Vittorio, thank you so much. We have the right to be optimistic only if we face the challenges and the dangers honestly. Thank you again for your brilliant lecture and a great Q&A session. Again, apologies to Warren that we couldn't accommodate the question. Dear all, thank you for participating and for your questions. This has been a virtual event. We owe a lot of gratitude to our tech and communications team for making this possible. Grant Osborne, Mel Webb, and Chen Lektansky, thank you so much. At the very end, may I please remind you that the Nanovic Institute will host another virtual lecture 2 weeks from now on March 23rd at 12:45. Paolo Carrozza, director of the Kellogg Institute and a Nanovic faculty fellow, will talk about the Venice Commission and current challenges of constitutionalism in Europe. Stay tuned. Many, many thanks again, Vittorio, and dear audience. Have a good afternoon and goodbye. Thank you.